Well, welcome everybody. It's so nice to see a full house. I'm Kathleen McCartney, Dean of the Harvard Graduate School of Education, and it's my honor and privilege to welcome you to tonight's Askwith Forum. As you know, tonight we'll hear from Tom Kane on the groundbreaking Measures of Effective Teaching project, and we're very fortunate to have with us Massachusetts Commissioner of Elementary and Secondary Education, Mitch Chester, who will serve as a discussant. So let me tell you a little bit about the format for tonight. Tom is going to present his findings first from this podium, and then Mitch will come up and share some comments. And then the three of us will come up to the stage, and I'm going to have the pleasure of asking the first question or two, but there should be plenty of time for all of you to ask your questions as well. So let me just say a little bit about Tom and Mitch. Tom, as many of you know, is a professor of education and economics here, as well as the faculty director for our Center for Education Policy Research. And for the past 4 years, Tom's been very busy. He's been serving as deputy director for research and data for the college-ready team at the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation. So Tom's research has already influenced how we think about a range of education issues, test score volatility, the economic payoff of a community college education, teacher certification and student performance, and Massachusetts charter and pilot schools. But tonight, Tom speaks as the lead researcher on the Gates Foundation's Measure of Effective Teaching project. The goal of this project is to help states and districts conduct fair and reliable assessments of teaching practice. I think this project has the potential to transform the way we think about the profession of teaching, and so does Deborah Ball, my colleague, who's Dean of the School of Education at Michigan. She told the New York Times that at Gates they're trying to do something that's never been done before. The study is absolutely unprecedented in scope, as you will see in a minute. Mitch Chester began serving as commissioner in May 2008. Massachusetts Secretary of Education Paul Reville, who's here tonight, has called Mitch superbly and uniquely qualified to lead the next ambitious stage of school reform in Massachusetts. Mitch began his career as an elementary school teacher in Connecticut, and he later served as a middle school assistant principal and district curriculum coordinator. Since then, he has held multiple senior leadership roles in education. He was the executive director of accountability and assessment for Philadelphia and senior associate superintendent for policy and accountability for the Ohio Department of Education. So I think you know why we've invited him to be here tonight. Please join me first in welcoming Tom Kane.
Thanks, Kathy, and thanks for giving me the flexibility to work on this project for these last 4 years. So I know that there are some folks in the audience that have worked on the MET project. I see Ron Ferguson here. The folks who worked on the project, would you be willing to stand up? Mary, I see you back there. So I just wanted to say what a privilege it's been to sort of work with you guys on this project. There were moments when this felt more like a movement than like a research project. There were other moments where it felt like something else, but you know better than I do how that felt. So back on January 6th, the New York Times reported on a paper by Raj Chetty, John Friedman, and Jonah Rockoff, reporting that teachers have long-term impacts on students' earnings and college attendance. Now, you know it's an important paper when the President of the United States mentions it in the State of the Union address less than 3 weeks later. Now, the President, in talking about it, missed one of the most important aspects of the study. So it's not just that teachers have a big impact on students later in life. If that's all we knew, there wouldn't be a whole lot of practical value because you'd have to wait 20 years to see who those teachers were. The really important finding from that paper was that one way to know who those teachers are is to look at their student achievement gains while the students are in the teachers' classrooms. Now, as important as that is, it's not enough for at least two reasons. One, that 3/4 of teachers are in grades and subjects where it's not possible to even measure student achievement gains because our assessments system doesn't cover those grades and subjects. But then a second limitation is that they don't even provide feedback on what a teacher might be able to do differently to improve. So for both of those reasons, we designed the Measures of Effective Teaching project to try to identify some other ways of providing feedback to teachers on specific strengths and weaknesses of their practice that are aligned with student achievement gains. So we're trying to find measures that if you added them to student achievement gains could help you have a more complete picture of a teacher's practice. Now, as we went in search of other ways of trying to measure teacher effectiveness, we recognized that there are three different entities in each classroom: the teacher, the student, and the content. We just wanted to make sure we had at least one measure on each side of this triangle. So the point wasn't just to do multiple measures for the sake of being multiple. We just wanted to measure different aspects of the problem. We wanted to make sure we had at least one measure on each of these sides. So we had student assessments, and we measure student assessments with gains on the state tests as well as some supplemental assessments that students took in the balanced assessment in math that probes students' conceptual understanding, not just their operational skills. In English language arts, students took an open-ended version of the Stanford 9 where they had to write short answer responses, not just answer multiple choice questions at the end of a reading passage. So we had both kinds of student outcomes. Next, we wanted to measure students' relationship to the teacher. Now, this is the way in higher education I get evaluated every semester. We wanted to just see whether you could do something similar in K-12. So it's ubiquitous in higher education, rare in K-12. We just wanted to see how well it would work. Next, we wanted to measure teachers' relationship to the content. So we gave teachers a test of pedagogical content knowledge that's not just content knowledge, not, do you understand how to add fractions yourself, but can you recognize the most common ways in which people will misunderstand adding fractions? So in this report, I'm going to focus on what we found with the student perceptions and the student assessments and classroom observations. In future reports, we'll be talking about the teacher assessment results. And then finally, we wanted to see how all of these things came together in the classroom. So almost every district does a classroom observation, and rather than pick one approach to doing classroom observations, we wanted to test multiple ways of doing a classroom observation. So we collected video in each of these teachers' classrooms, and then with the video, we rated it using five different instruments. Framework for Teaching, Charlotte Danielson's instrument. Class, that Bob Pianta at University of Virginia developed. Mathematical Quality of Instruction, that Heather Hill here at the Harvard Graduate School of Education worked on. Plato, that Pam Grossman for English Language Arts classrooms developed at Stanford. And then in this report, we'll be talking about a rubric, the You Teach Teacher Observation Protocol that the National Math and Science Initiative developed for observing in math classrooms. So one of the things that makes this project unique is the variety of measures that we're using for trying to measure effective teaching. One, we're using these 5 different instruments for classroom observations, the student survey and value added. Second, it's unique in terms of its scale. So there were 3,000 teacher volunteers working with us in 7 different school districts. There are 6 really where most of the data collection went on. New York City, Charlotte, Mecklenburg, Memphis, Hillsborough, which is Tampa, Florida, Dallas, and Denver were the 6 districts where we're working. In this report that we just released, it's based on the 22,000 classroom observation scores. We trained, our partners, ETS, trained 900 people to do this scoring of the videos. Now, we didn't just want to know whether the instructional experts that developed these instruments and their handpicked graduate students or assistants could identify effective teaching. We wanted to know whether folks with little beyond a background in teaching and a bachelor's degree could do it. So that's why we used these 900 different raters to watch these classroom observations. And in the results I'll be talking about today, there were 44,000 students in these classrooms. Now, we're going to be looking at a variety of different student outcomes. We'll be looking at value-added gains on the state math and ELA tests. We'll be looking at value-added gains on the supplemental assessments in math and English language arts, the balanced assessment and the open-ended Stanford 9. But then we're also going to look at some squishier outcomes like the students' self-reported levels of effort and the students' enjoyment in class. Now we're going to look at these not because we think those outcomes could show up in an accountability system, but we just wanted to see, to what extent are these measures consistent with these other outcomes that parents, I as a parent, and I'm sure many of the parents in the audience would worry about, and teachers would worry about. So we look at those as well. Now, first, I'm going to talk about what we found about a classroom observation, because this turns out to be the hardest thing about the project, and I think most school districts and states will find that this is the hardest part of the job too. Now, there are 4 different steps, 4 different components to doing a classroom observation well. The first is just defining expectations clearly, ensuring observer accuracy, measuring the reliability of the results, and then finally determining alignment with outcomes. So the first step, defining expectations clearly. Before somebody walks in to do a classroom observation, there are millions of different things that somebody could be looking for when they walk into a classroom. An instrument should boil down the million possibilities into a set of discrete competencies and then be clear about what effective and ineffective practice looks like on each one. Now, here I'm just showing the results from the Charlotte Danielson's frameworks for teaching, but the general pattern looks similar across the others as well. First thing to notice is there are an awful lot of people in the middle. There are relatively few people at the bottom and the top of the distribution on the Danielson instrument. The second thing I wanted to show, though, was just show you the specific language for one of the competencies, because it makes clear just why this process turns out to be so hard. So this drop-down tab describes the language around using questioning and discussion techniques. Now, if I walked into somebody's classroom, a teacher should get a low score on that competency if, as an observer, I see a teacher asking a bunch of yes-no questions that involve just a small number of students in the class, and where the teacher is involved in all the mediating all the questions. So all the teacher's asking the questions and all the responses are coming to him or her. Now, a teacher would get a top score on the Danielson instrument if the questions are asking students to explain their understanding of something. So not just a yes-no. If many of the students in the classroom are involved in the questioning, I see some students from my class in this room, and if the students initiate some of the questions and ask each other some of the questions. Now, notice two things about this. One is this isn't a simple checklist. It involves judgment. And that different people, even if you've tried to be clear about what the practices are, different people watching the same class may come up with a different rating. And that's particularly true since almost all the action is in the middle. Notice that while it's fairly easy to imagine distinguishing between advanced and unsatisfactory, proficient and basic, that's where almost all the action is much harder to discern. The second thing to notice is that this would likely depend on the topic being covered. So I've just been doing an intro to program evaluation in my class, and I'm sure if somebody came in and did use the Danielson instrument, I would have gotten an unsatisfactory in these first three. I'm not going to ask for show of hands, but for students who were in my class, they could say, Tom did an awful lot of talking during those first 3 days. Well, it was a result of the nature of the content we were covering. And that hopefully when somebody came back later in the semester, I would verge up towards at least proficient, maybe on a good day, advanced. But it'll be very different from class to class. And we actually saw some evidence of that there's variation from lesson to lesson, even for the same teacher. Now, the second thing that we had to worry about, and any school district or state will face the same problem, is just trying to ensure accuracy of the observations. So the way we did that was, rather than just train people, at the end of the training, we made sure we showed people a set of videos that had been pre-scored by the people who'd been trained, handpicked by the instrument developers, and then checked to see you could only score if the scores that you gave were within a minimum distance from the scores that the experts had given. There was a maximum number of discrepancies that you could have in your scores. So as the Gates Foundation is going to be trying to make that easier for school districts to do, we're going to be providing software with the videos from this MET project, and that a school district could go through beforehand and pre-score them, asking experts, or better yet, the teachers in their district to pre-score them, and then principals, before they could do an official observation, would need to be able to show, at least at first, that they could replicate the scores on those videos with a maximum number of discrepancies. There'll be some, but there'll be should be a limit on it. Third, we didn't just assume that after the training and after people had passed certification that they would score reliably. And school districts shouldn't assume that either. They should monitor reliability. Now, the way we did that was we went out and took a random sample of videos and had them double scored. And we looked to see to what extent the scores varied by observer, varied by lesson. In the research report that's available on this project, we describe how a school district could do something similar, draw 100 teachers at random, have an impartial observer go out and do an extra observation, and then by looking at the relationship between those observation scores by the impartial observers and the official observations for those teachers, could gauge the reliability of the system overall. Now, you'd have to do it much larger to do it school by school, but just to get a sense for how the system as a whole is performing, it would be a fairly straightforward and not a gigantic, undertaking, and we describe how to do that. Now, one of the things that we learned in this is, we wanted, and a school district would want, to have a measure that is a reliable measure of the consistent aspects of a teacher's practice, not even of a particular lesson. You wanted to know how much of the variation in the scores sticks with the teacher across multiple lessons as opposed to variation that's attributable to the rater, variation that's attributable to the particular lesson. We even looked at the variation that was attributable to the particular group of students in the class, because for each teacher we had, if they taught multiple sections, we observed them in two different groups with two different groups of students. So we could see to what extent it varied, not just by lesson, but by the students in front of the classroom. Now, we learned that if you just looked at one observation, less than about a third of the variance in scores that you see is attributable to consistent aspects of the teacher's practice. The rest is due to differences in rater judgment, differences from lesson to lesson, differences, for student score. So one observation, at least we found, was a very noisy measure of practice. Now, even with trained raters. So there are two different things that you could do to try to raise reliability. One would be to try to dumb down the instrument and just focus on the aspects where you could get 100% rater judgment, rater agreement. So you could eliminate the rater judgment problem by focusing on trivial things like, did the class start on time? Did the teacher write the objective on the blackboard? Was the teacher wearing a tie? Like, those are the kinds of things that you could eliminate the rater judgment, but probably is not all that related to students' achievement gains. The things that matter in teaching, like questioning skills, you can't eliminate judgment. So the second approach would be to say, let's get multiple observations and let's average them. So that's what we did. So we found that if you did 4 different observations, in this case, each by a different observer, at that point you could get to the point where more than 2/3 of the variance, or about 2/3 of the variance, was associated with consistent aspects of a teacher's practice. Now, we're not saying that every district that the answer, there's some magical answer, 4 observations by 4 different raters, because there were unique things about our project. On the one hand, our people were watching video as opposed to being there in person. That probably lowered our reliability. Second, the people doing the observations had no information about the context. They just saw a video. They knew nothing about the students or the school or whatever. That also probably lowered reliability. But there were some other things about our study that probably increased reliability, and that is none of our observers had any sort of personal relationship with the people they were observing, which can be distracting either in a positive or a negative way, right? So we're not saying 4 is the magic number. We're saying that it's important, though, to monitor the reliability And we think it's very likely you're going to need to observe on more than one occasion because there's a big chunk of the variation that is due to lesson-to-lesson variance. Okay, the final step is just check alignment with other outcomes. Now, here, the way to read these graphs, on the x-axis is the percentile of the teacher's score on each of the instruments. Now, because some of the instruments are on 4-unit scales and some are on 7-unit scales, rather than, it would have been crazy to show it by the scale of each of the instruments. So instead, we just showed it by percentile. So the folks towards the bottom had lower scores on each of the instruments. The folks at the top had higher scores. Now, the vertical axis in each of these is value added on a particular type of test. So in the top left is value added on the state math tests. The top right is value added on the balanced assessment of math. The bottom left is value added on the state ELA test. Bottom right is value added on the open-ended version of the Stanford 9. We measured it in terms of scale, in terms of months of learning, but if people want to convert that back into standard deviations, we tell you how to do that. But the three things to notice about these graphs are, first, all the slopes are sloped up. That's a good thing, right? You want to know that the people who scored higher on these instruments had higher student achievement gains on average. The second thing to notice is that none of these instruments really jumped out as being much more predictive than the others. On some outcomes, some are more predictive than others, but they sort of clump together. There's not a dramatic outlier that's better than the others. The third thing to notice is all these slopes are flatter for the state ELA tests. So that should be, for anybody who's done this kind of work, that shouldn't be a huge surprise. So if you go to the What Works Clearinghouse and just look at impacts of almost any education intervention, if you find that they have statistically significant impacts, 9 out of 10 times it's going to be in math, not in ELA. Now, I used to think, and I think a lot of people have this vague idea in their mind, that that just reflects the fact that families and not teachers have big impacts on literacy scores. I think that's sort of the hypothesis a lot of people think is explaining what's going on there. I think that's potentially wrong because of the bottom right graph. What we found was that when we measured open-ended students' ability to write answers, we found teacher effects and slopes that were much more like we found in math. And so one hypothesis is that outside of grades 1, 2, 3, teachers aren't mostly teaching reading comprehension. They're teaching other things like writing. And that because most of the state ELA tests these days are only testing reading comprehension with multiple choice questions. They're not, most of them, not here in Massachusetts, are not asking kids to do much writing. And that one possibility is that the assessments that are testing students' literacy skills beyond just reading comprehension are going to be more sensitive and more aligned with these classroom observations. Now, next, I just wanted to talk a little bit about what we found in the student feedback. Although we had an earlier report from last December that focused on this. Here we're using a survey that Ron Ferguson, who's here in the front row, developed for measuring students' experiences in classrooms. And this chart will just give you a flavor of the types of questions that students are responding to. By the way, this is one of the things that I noticed in talking about this and trying to, all of the teachers that are participating in this are volunteers. So at the beginning of the project, we had to do a lot of sales to try to get people interested in this project. And one thing I noticed was that if you just say student feedback or student surveys, there's a little hesitation. As I'm sure, like the first dean that proposed measuring, the quality of instruction in higher education, their name is lost to history because I'm sure like their senior faculty didn't appreciate that very much. But one thing I learned was that if you got people to look at the questions, much of the resistance sort of, melted away. So it's important to note this isn't just a popularity contest. The questions are focusing on specific aspects of practice. So, our class stays busy and doesn't waste time. The way to read this is the bottom left, the number on the left is the 25th percentile proportion of kids agreeing. And the number on the right is the 75th percentile proportion of kids in the class agreeing. So in a quarter of classrooms, more than 69% of kids are agreeing with the statement, our class stays busy and doesn't waste time. But in another quarter of classrooms, a third or fewer of kids are agreeing with that. Okay, so there's huge spread in the student responses on these items. Just a sense of, some of the others. In this class, we learned to correct our mistakes. In a quarter of classrooms, about half or less of kids agree with that statement. In another quarter of classrooms, more than 83% of kids agree with that statement. So there's a huge amount of variation between class, and in results we talk about in the paper, it's surprising the degree to which students in one class taught by the teacher will say the same things as students in another class taught by the same teacher. Okay, so section 3. Now, in this, we wanted to look at these various ways of measuring effective practice. We wanted to say, what were the classroom observations? What were the student surveys? What were the gains on the state tests? What were the combination of these measures? When a teacher worked with one group of students. And then we said, how were those related to student achievement gains when the same teacher worked with another group of students, either in the same year or but in a different section or in a different school year. Now, the reason why we did this is this sort of mimics what we would hope a school principal is doing. That a school principal is saying, what does this teacher's track record, their classroom observations, the student surveys, the value added, with one group of students say about their likely success when working with a different group of students. So our analytic approach here was just sort of mimicking what we hope decision makers would be doing. And we're going to compare these different measures on 3 different criteria. Predictive power, so which measure could most accurately identify the teachers who were going to have large student achievement gains with another group of students. Which measures were reliable, so which were most stable from section to section or from year to year. And then third, which had the most potential for offering diagnostic insight for a teacher who's trying to improve their practice but is not sure what they might do differently. Now, so here was sort of an epiphany that came to me, just in the last couple of months working on this project, is that, and it came, I have to attribute this to my 6-year-old son, so who understands this in a much more profound way than I did. That if you're going to have a team of superheroes, you don't want 3 supermen. You want 3 people, each with different superpowers. So you want somebody who can stretch, really far. You want somebody who can, is really, really strong. You want somebody who can, run really fast. So you want to have a team of superheroes, each with a different superpower. You shouldn't look for, try to find the most super of the supermen. You should be looking for different measures that have different strengths. And that turned out to be the case here. So for value added, it was the most predictive if your goal was to identify which teachers are most likely to have large student achievement gains with a different group of students. Knowing their student achievement gains with one group of students turns out to be the best single predictor of that. Second, the student survey was also had predictive power, not as much as value added by itself, but it turned out that the student survey, at least in our study, had the highest reliability. It was the least volatile. Now, I mean, maybe Ron was expecting that. I didn't expect that beforehand, but in retrospect, it makes a ton of sense. Because remember, the 2 things that made a classroom observation unreliable were differences in rate or judgment and lesson-to-lesson variation. I'm sure it's true that a trained adult would be more discerning than the average youth, and we're looking at grades 4 to 8, so we're not looking at really young kids, but it's grades 4 to 8. So a trained adult is going to be more discerning than the average youth, but you get to average over 35 of them rather than averaging over 2 or 3 observers. So there's that, but also students are there for 180 days. They're not just there for the 3 or 4 lessons. And remember, there's a huge amount of lesson-to-lesson variation. So, whether that's the reason or not, the bottom line was we found higher reliability for the student surveys than we did for the other measures, at least within the bounds of the number of observations that seemed realistic. Now, whereas value added had very little diagnostic insight, just tells you whether things are good or bad, the student survey, because it's looking at specific aspects of practice, has the potential for helping a teacher identify the things that they might, need to work on. So I'm sure, I'm told this every year, and I work on it every year, and I'm planting this idea in my students' mind now, I realize, but I have a problem with time management. I know that. So my students will say that. I've learned that from looking at my student surveys. So that would be the kind of thing we would hope other teachers would get from this process, is identifying particular aspects of practice they need to work on. Finally, the observation of the 3 had the least predictive power, and I'll show you in a second. Reliability could be medium or high. It could be high if you did, 7 or 8, a large number of observations, but it's costly to get there. But probably has the highest potential for diagnostic insight, for helping identify particular aspects of practice to work on. Now, here's a graph that at least summarizes at least a couple of those points I was just making. So On the x-axis is reliability when measured just in one course section. On the y-axis is correlation with underlying value added in math. So you want, so the y-axis is sort of a measure of predictive power, and the x-axis is a measure of reliability. Now, if you look, framework, so this is just for using observations alone. Framework for teaching, had the lowest predictive power, moderate reliability. The student survey had more predictive power and the highest reliability. The value added alone was correlated, almost 0.7 with underlying value added, and we can talk in the questions about that. What is underlying value added? But the two gray dots measure the combinations of the three. One is equally weighted, so just using a third, a third, a third, and the other was using the data to decide which combination is most predictive of value added in another classroom or another year. But notice that by combining the three, you get more of both things that you want. You get more reliability and you get more predictive power, particularly in the criterion-weighted example. Now, the last section, I just wanted to talk about the debate that I'm sure is going to go on in every state that is, and I recognize Massachusetts is one of the states that have gotten Race to the Top funding. We will hear a debate, and it's already started in many states, and it's an appropriate discussion, but to some extent, it's focused on the wrong thing. We'll hear a debate about all the ways in which these measures could be misleading. So we'll hear the case of, the lack of reliability in classroom observations, in value added, in the student surveys, and the potential, which is real, that the results, if the student surveys counted for something, might be different. But we should always be asking, and this is the thing that I hope people will be asking, is the predictive power of this measure better than the information we're acting on now? So no information is going to be perfect. The right comparator is not perfection. The right comparator is the other information that school districts are acting on now. All right? So in this last section of slides, we just said, okay, how well does this combined measure, using value added on the state test, using the student perceptions, and using the classroom observation, how well does this combined measure perform relative to the two things that school districts are making high stakes decisions on now, master's degrees and experience? That's the right comparator. It shouldn't be perfection. It should be, how are these things related to a series of outcomes, including gains on the state test, but other tests as well. So here, in the way to read these graphs is we're looking at the top quartile on these various measures compared to the average teacher, and then we're looking at the bottom quartile compared to the average teacher. And these numbers are the estimated impacts in terms of months of learning gains. So master's degrees. Actually, it turns out none of those differences were statistically significant. And they were small to begin with. That in terms of predicting gains on the state math or state ELA tests, you could do a heck of a lot better using this combination. In fact, at least in math, there are huge differences. Top quartile gained 4.5 months relative to the average teacher. Bottom quartile lost 3.1 months. Now, you might say, okay, that's unfair because even though you were predicting outcomes in another class, or we weren't literally using value added from the same class to predict value added in the same class. We were using value added from one class to predict value added in another class. So, but still, to some extent, you'd expect that value added on that measure ought to be more predictive than other stuff. So we looked at some other outcomes. We looked at gains on these other tests that we gave. So we said, again, the ranking we're just doing with value added on the state test. And then we're asking, now by the way, 3 out of 4 of these weren't statistically significant. But there was if you looked at the top quartile versus the bottom quartile, there was a 4.5-month difference in student achievement gains when teachers were ranked this way, just on the state test, when you looked at their students' gains on the balanced assessment in math. So even though the balanced assessment in math played no direct role in forming the measure of a teacher's effectiveness, in this project, we had a unique opportunity to say, well, gosh, you know, how well did their students do on this other test, and how did this compare? Now, I'm not saying that all the teachers with gains on the state math test also saw gains on these other tests. That's not true, actually. It turns out that the correlation is not perfect. But that's not the point. The point should be, okay, would master's degrees in experience be any more correlated with those other outcomes than this combined measure would be? And what we found was that this combined measure did better on those outcomes as well. Next, we just said, okay, how about if you look at other student outcomes, like you asked about students' self-reported levels of effort and just students' enjoyment in class. So again, the folks in the top and the bottom on this combined measure did better than the average teacher on those types of outcomes as well. And these, again, these other 4 differences were not statistically significant. So as we go into this debate, we shouldn't just be asking, can I think of a way in which each of these, is there some aspect of teaching these measures are missing? We should talk about that, but we should also talk about, do I think that the things that we're currently using to make decisions would be more correlated with those outcomes than the combined, the imperfect measures that we're testing? So here, I just want to talk about the upcoming report. So this is not the final report from the project. There at least a couple more reports that we're going to be issuing this year, this summer. I think it's realistic to say. I used to put a particular month up there, and I've learned not to do that. So we're saying mid-2012, which I think counts like up until August, September. That probably counts as mid. But I think we'll actually get both of these done, by the end of the summer. One is focused on the weighting issue. So so we're saying, many states are having to make decisions about how to weight the different components. Now, we're going to be not talking about a magic set of weights. We're going to be saying, what are some rationales for thinking about the weighting problem? And what would be the implications of each of those? So if you're trying to maximize predictive power, what would you do? If you're trying to maximize reliability, what would you do? If you're trying to maximize some weighted average of predictive power and reliability, what would you do? And how much does it matter? Because if it turns out that each of these weighting schemes are really highly correlated, why are we arguing about it? Because it'll turn out to not matter all that much. So I'm not trying to foreshadow our results. I'm just trying to say that'll be one of the questions we'll be asking, is how how are these things related? What would, and it could be that some matter more than others, but the point is we can try to shed some light on that with some analysis and evidence. The second report that'll be coming out later will be using random assignment. Now, folks will correctly point out that, hey, wait a minute, you've controlled for students' baseline scores and demographics and other stuff, but maybe there are some unobserved characteristics of classrooms that you haven't controlled for. So, you can look good. It's easy to get enthusiastic student responses if your students are really engaged in school, but it's the students and not the teachers you're measuring. Or it may be you look good in a classroom observation if your students are show up to school, excited about learning, but it's the students and not the teacher you're measuring. The only way to answer that is to do some random assignments. So teachers agreed in the study to, within a particular grade and subject, agreed to draw straws to determine which classroom to teach, and in that final report we'll be looking at impacts on student achievement at the end of the year. Okay, so why don't I stop there? I think we're good. We've got like a half hour now for. Mitch has comments, and then we'll be opening up for questions.
Is the wireless working? Is the wireless working? I don't know. There we go. Okay. Good evening. Can everybody hear me? Yeah. Okay. Great. I am always just usually provoked when I see Tom, when I talk to Tom about this study. I mean, I think it's an incredible study, well designed, and I always tease him that he's got to be the envy of all of his colleagues. He's got one of the most incredible data sets that we've ever, I think, collected on our teaching force and try to tease out of that what we can learn from that. What I'd like to do with just a couple of minutes is talk about the policy and practice context in which the evidence that Tom provided gets put into play. And I'd like to think about, I know we've got some superintendents here. I know Jeff Young from Cambridge, Alan Ingram from Springfield. So I want to put myself in their shoes. Superintendents of two large districts, and they're trying to figure out where to go with teacher evaluation, thinking about teacher effects and how best to make sure that teachers are getting the best feedback, the best support for development that they can get, as well that the district knows who's getting the job done and who isn't and makes decisions based on that. So I want to highlight what you might think of as two tensions in the data that Tom presented when it comes to implementing this in a policy and a practice context. One of the tensions Tom started to get at, I think, is sort of the developmental trajectory of this. I mean, Tom's data is starting to tell us what would a really, really strong system look like. And the problem is that for many of us, we're starting from incredibly weak systems, and we're not going to get from here to there in one leap. So how do we think about that trajectory? We might think about it as not making perfect or not even making excellent the enemy of good. The second tension is a tension that psychometricians at least used to use the terms false positives and false negatives, and how you might think about that in a policy context. So let me start with the second, the false positives and false negatives. So thinking, kind of putting a policy lens on this, a value lens on this. If my greatest concern, if my only concern was avoiding making damaging decisions about adults that are unwarranted, right? Arriving at false negative conclusions, arriving at a conclusion that an adult is not doing well by the students that he or she has in front of her. If my only concern was that, then I'd be designing a system that had every possible safeguard, all kinds of elements to not rely on any single measures too much, any single assessment measures, student achievement measures, not rely on single evaluators, have an army of evaluators and cross-reference what different people see and so forth. Which would be pretty bulky, but it would build in a whole lot of safeguards. So if I ever did reach the conclusion that a given teacher is really not good for kids, not doing a good job with kids, in fact is doing a pretty poor job with kids, I'd have a huge degree of confidence in that decision. I could think about the other extreme, right? I could think about if my only concern was that I not put any kids in front of teachers. In fact, if you could put up slide 10, if you go back to slide 10, if my only concern is that I not put students in front of teachers who are going to, at best, slow down their development, and maybe even worse, sort of stagnate their development. So not only is there an opportunity cost because they're not in front of a good teacher, but there's actually damage done. If that was sort of my premier concern, and I was designing a system that would guard against that being the outcome, then I would design a very different system, right? I would err on the side of any measures that give me any suggestion that the adult who's in front of the student is in fact not good for that student, not doing well by those students. I would sort of minimize false positives. Now the cost of either of those, right, the cost of minimizing false positives is that you really maximize a lot of false negatives. And on the other end of the extreme, the cost of erring on the side of only looking out for, only avoid unwarranted employment decisions about adults is that you maximize false positives. So how do you design a system that does a good job of balancing both of those? I mean, the study that just came out that Tom referenced was astounding. It added to, at least for me, the body of evidence that I'm aware of that we make a difference in this profession. That should be really good news. Should be really good news to know that teachers make a difference, that we make a difference in kids' lives, that the efforts we put in the classroom, in our schools, make a difference. And the difference can be huge. The difference between, and you'll correct me if I'm misinterpreting the tables, between teachers who routinely are getting low gains, low results for their students, low learning for their students, versus teachers who are routinely getting high results for their students are consequential. And the study that Tom referenced suggests now that they're consequential well into adulthood, perhaps, in very, very substantial ways. So, so this tension between false positives, false negatives, and how we design the system is one that you know, I think a lot about. And I do believe that we have a mission in the public education system to make sure that we're doing right by students. We have an obligation to support our teaching force, because we're only going to do right by our students with our teaching force. And so how do we support them, support their development, support their continuous growth, but how do we identify those who are not doing a good job, and despite the opportunity to improve that, are not getting there, and how do we make decisions about that is really critical. So one of the questions I have for Tom is whether or not you think about observations, the combination of the various inputs, the various factors, differently at the tails than you do in the middle. So can those observers more quickly with less number of observations needed pretty accurately identify the folks who are really at the low end of performance, those who are really at the high end of performance consistently? And if so, we should factor that into our thinking about the systems that we build. The other tension, the developmental trajectory kind of tension, it was striking to me, and my board chair, Maura Bantha, is here. Maura, give a wave, please. Courageous leadership in the Commonwealth and around the area of teacher evaluation and administrator evaluation, educator evaluation. We adopted a new set of regulations and are in the process of putting in a new set of protocols for evaluation that are designed to make student learning central in the whole process. And one of the things that we learn at the front end of this process, and some of you may have known this all along, is that the baseline was pretty poor. And we're talking about in Massachusetts, a state that that has one of the highest, I'd argue, the highest performing K-12 public system in the nation. The baseline around teacher evaluation was inconsistent, was in some cases just pro forma, just sort of a routine that didn't have any substance around teaching and learning. And we heard that from all sectors. We heard that from teachers. We heard that from administrators. I don't think anybody made the case that we've got a great system in Massachusetts, leave it alone. Now, it was inconsistent. There were places where it's done well, but there were lots of places where it's done poorly, and some places where teachers went years without really getting feedback or any kind of formal evaluation. So that was sort of the starting point, right? That was the starting place. So we built a structure through regulations, a set of requirements that made student learning central to the process. We avoided the debate that some states have gone through around what percentage should student learning have. And it's a good thing we avoided it, because you're going to figure that out, right, through the weighting process. But what we said instead is we need to look at a variety of inputs, a variety of indicators of instruction in the classroom based on observation, based on student surveys. We built into the requirements that student voice, student surveys, and through the efforts, through the work that Ron Ferguson and Tom revealed, made us confident that building that in was the right thing to do and would add to the information in both valid and reliable ways on where we had strong things happening in classrooms and where we had weak practice happening in classrooms. So through a variety of measures, observation and otherwise, an evaluator makes a judgment about the level of an individual's practice, rates it on a 4-point scale, and then independently the evaluator looks at the evidence for the educator's impact on student learning. And it's the intersection of those two data points, those two conclusions. They're more than data points because they come from multiple indicators. It's the intersection of those two that determines what kind of either growth plan or improvement plan, what kind of status, what kind of consequences accrue to the educator, whether or not there's a lot of concern, whether or not there's strong support for that educator continuing. But I met today with the superintendents statewide, had about 200 superintendents in the room, and the evaluation rollout is really very, very high on their anxiety list, because for many of them this is a real culture change, and for many principals this is a huge culture change, because the message here is that your job has to be first and foremost about attending to the program of instruction in your school, about spending time in classrooms, about paying attention to curriculum and instruction. And for many of our administrators, that has not been the job they've been doing. In some cases, they've been doing it well, but in many cases, it's not what they've focused on. And they're worried about it. Their first impulse is, I've got a full-time job. And my response in part is, this is really the central work of schools. Curriculum and instruction is the core work of schools. And it's got to be the priority of our staff in the schools, of our administrators, of our teachers. So that work's rolling out. Part of the message we're delivering is, don't make perfect the enemy of good. Year one, you're not going to be great at it. You're going to stumble. You won't have a complete system to implement. Year two, we'll have more of the pieces put together. You'll be feel a little more competent at this. Year three will be even better. But there is a developmental trajectory to this. And part of that is getting into classrooms and getting in there, knowing that for many of the folks who will be in those classrooms, they haven't been doing a lot of that. And many of them probably feel pretty inadequate about going into those classrooms. But we got to get it started. So I would highlight those two tensions, Tom, and as you think about the research and how it gets implemented in practice at scale, both the policy and the practice, it's that tension between how do we get it going and build it to be more and more sophisticated, and then secondly, how do we think about the issue of erring on the side of avoiding inappropriate sanctions for adults on the one hand, and ensuring that students have strong instruction on the other. Thank you. Should I?
I think we're going to open it up because Tom was correct in his assessment about time management. So I see that we have a lot of stand at the microphones, and why don't you ask the first question?
I taught elementary school. I'll try and project. My name is Emily Ackman. I actually work at the Department of Elementary and Secondary Education. I'm working on educator evaluation rollout, and I've been reading stuff from the MET project, and we at the state don't have Gates kind of money, and so I would like to know sort of these, of your recommendations and of what you found with limited resources, what you think preliminarily what you think would be most effective, and what especially tangibly we could apply.
So this is something that I, and I'm sure Mitch, really worry about, and that is that in order to do this right, it's just impossible to do it really cheap, and that it's not absurdly expensive. Even in districts like Hillsborough County, Florida, which does a large number of observations, I think up to 8 observations for beginning teachers. They're doing it for about 2% of teacher payroll. So what we're talking about is not a huge expenditure, but given that we're investing practically nothing in it so far, it would represent in some places more. I think it's worth thinking about other places like in school budgets where there are few demonstrable impacts, and that is like most of the PD right now. I think there's little evidence that that's having an impact. Could some of those budgets be devoted for doing this? This kind of feedback is probably the most powerful, most useful kind of PD we could do. But That said, some of the things are relatively inexpensive. So the value-added part of it's not, a couple of dollars even at most per student. The student surveys at most, I think, $5 per student would be the way top end. So there, but. The most expensive part of this is the classroom observation, and I don't think, what I'm scared of is that districts will try to do that cheap and focus on the other stuff. I think it's important. I think if all of this is about diagnostic feedback to help people improve, it'll be critical to do it with classroom observations in a careful way. And I think what we're learning is that to do that carefully, there has to be at least some impartial observer rather than just have the principals do it. Having some, principals will play a critical role and will have to do some of the observations, but having some resources set aside for the impartial observers to do observations, I think will be critical.
So Tom, let me push you a little bit on, if my guess is 75–80% of your budgets are in salaries in our school districts in Massachusetts. Your last several sets of analyses suggest that we may not be paying for the right stuff. We may not be rewarding through compensation the right stuff. How do you think about that?
So I already mentioned PD as a place in budgets that aren't all that productive. Another place is nationally we spend $8 to $15 billion a year on salary differentials associated with master's degrees. And I hate this sitting here at a graduate school of education. I feel, I'm self-conscious mentioning it, but I think there's not a ton of evidence that kind of expenditure really is making much of a difference. And so we need to be thinking, about where are there places we could go inside budgets to find the resources to pay for some of these things that we need to be doing.
Thank you.
Can I ask you too about the effect sizes? I mean, if the effect sizes were huge in terms of predicting student gains, and I don't think they were, but maybe you could comment on that. If they were huge, then it might incentivize school districts to implement one of these measures on a large scale. So can you comment on that?
So if you look at the combined measure, so if you look at student perceptions plus value added plus classroom observations, I think the impacts are huge. So the difference between a top and bottom quartile, having a top and bottom quartile teacher in math is, a quarter of the black-white achievement gap, closed in 1 year. That's a pretty big difference. Now, it's almost a whole school year's worth of learning, being a top versus bottom quartile, teacher. So almost 9 months worth, like it's about 8 months worth of learning. Now, that's big by any measure. Now, if you look at any of the pieces by themselves, the classroom observation by itself is not big. And in the student feedback just by itself is not gigantic. But it's the combination, really, I think.
It's reasonable.
Yeah.
Okay.
Hi. My name is Dan Rothstein. And I was intrigued by thinking about a connection between Ron Ferguson's work on student engagement and the teacher observation. With Lou Santana, who's the co-director of the Right Question Institute, we wrote a book called Make Just One Change, Teach Students to Ask Their Own Questions. And what we saw was that when teachers were teaching students how to ask their own questions, we saw 3 indicators of changes in students. One is they were more engaged. Second, they took more ownership of their learning. And third, that they named themselves that they were learning more. And it seemed to me when I was looking at the student engagement surveys is that there's huge potential for simplifying some of the gathering of accurate feedback on what's happening in the classroom by combining some measures of students being engaged, taking ownership of their learning by actually being able to assess what are they doing differently. And what you have is the fourth measure from Danielson's on questioning. Are they asking questions? There are other indicators that teachers could point to in terms of completing assignments, of thinking of going further, of understanding more. And so I'm just wondering, is there a way to think about combining the student engagement with the teacher observation to create a simpler reporting process?
So the important thing to remember is this whole field is at a very early stage. You know, so this is the first large study of this type. So now, one thing I didn't mention is that the Gates Foundation has made a grant to the University of Michigan to be a data store for all of the data coming out of this project. Now, other people at other universities, including Harvard, will have access to it. But the goal, hopefully, people will be using those videos and the student feedback and whatever to develop the next generation of the classroom observation instrument. Now, you point to, I think, a really interesting approach, and that is each of the classroom observation instruments try to measure student engagement in some way, but with an adult watching in the classroom trying to measure the level, that's probably best measured with the student responses. So maybe there's a way to simplify, to offload some of the things that we're currently trying to pack into a classroom observation onto the student survey, and maybe vice versa. That kind of refinement is what I hope will be happening over the next few years.
Great.
You know, if I might, there's a really, this sort of stretches your question beyond the specifics. Among the race to the top states that won race to the top dollars, there's a very robust discussion going on right now, comparing notes on the implementation of our teacher evaluation component of our race to the top agendas. Each of the 12 states is implementing a more robust approach to teacher evaluation. That conversation has evolved to a conversation about how to systematically link the implementation of the evaluation systems with the initiative, the effort to implement the Common Core state standards, because each of the race to the top states has made a commitment to the Common Core state standards. In Massachusetts, we've incorporated them within our new frameworks. And those standards at their core are about, particularly in the, literacy is about reading complex texts, increasingly complex text, writing to text, getting the writing beyond personal narrative. And so it strikes me that if we are successful in marrying those initiatives, so it's not a teacher evaluation initiative over here and a curriculum improvement, instructional improvement initiative over here, there could be some real strong synergy there.
Okay. You're next, and then other side.
Hi, my name is Maite Antella. I'm an EPM student here, getting a master's degree.
Do it for the love of learning.
Yes, exactly. That's actually true because I'm already a school psychologist, so yes, that is correct. But I was wondering, when you were talking about measuring the relationship between the students and the teachers, and also thinking about what the commissioner said about balancing what you're measuring in terms of students and how you're protecting them versus protecting the adults and the teachers. And I was wondering if there's any idea or thought in the future of adding how you're measuring the teachers' perceptions of the students. And I know that there's a professor here, and I can't remember his name, that is doing measurement around that. And then I was also thinking, just standing here, about measuring the teachers' perceptions of their own skills and seeing if you could marry those in some way.
So,
maybe try to be, we have 5 minutes left, and it would be great to get a bunch of questions.
So a quick thing, so we didn't capture teachers' impression of their students, but one thing that the teachers who did the observations for us told us, which seems really important, it was all anecdotal, it wasn't, but they said, wow, it was so valuable to watch myself teach, or it was so, and for the raters who watched all these videos, they were saying, whoa, this makes me think about my teaching in a whole different way, to be able to watch, 30, 40, 50 other teachers teach. And so, and that seems like a really important part of this, is trying to create more of a self-consciousness about practice.
Okay, next.
My name is Laurel Schwartz. I'm in the school leadership program, and I was wondering, in putting this together, if you took into account the overall school environment and the support that the teachers had for the instructional core outside their classroom, and if not, why, and if that's something that will be considered in the future.
So we did do a survey of where we asked teachers about the level of support that they're getting in the classrooms. From their principals. So actually, we used a survey, in fact, that I think Massachusetts did statewide a few years ago. And in our final report, we'll include some results from that. We have not been finished analyzing that yet.
Okay. Yes.
Hi, my name is Matt Kraft. I'm a doctoral student here. My question is about the classroom observation instruments. I'm wondering if we can have our cake and eat it too. We've talked about using them to predict student outcomes and to use them to refine teaching practices. And I was wondering whether you thought that one instrument itself can achieve both those aims. Are they potentially problematic, in that to best predict outcomes, we might need to move away from the instrument that gives us the richest feedback we would want on instruction, and would using an instrument that we hope to use in a formative way, but attach stakes to it for evaluation, change the way it's used in a formative practice?
So I think that we are way too afraid to link formative and summative. That I'm going to pay a lot more attention to a particular set of feedback if I know eventually it's going to be summative. So like, to tell me that I'm weak at something but it doesn't really count is a little absurd. So I think that the kind of feedback that will be lead to improvement will be things that are aligned. One of the problems, honestly, that we need to figure out is, if you're only getting feedback once a year, like if you're getting a value-added score once a year, or you're getting the student feedback once a year, or the classroom observation once a year, it's hard for that not to feel purely summative and not formative. It's much, so Kathy knows this. I lost weight a few years ago, and so I weigh myself every single day. The way I motivated myself was that repeated feedback. And I think something similar, if we want teachers to feel this as an empowering thing, we can't just measure it once a year. You've got to be able to get some feedback, work at it, see an improvement, see it and measure it again. And we're doing a pilot of that in some classrooms in New York City. Ron actually is working on it to give teachers multiple forms of feedback through the student surveys, give them some PD, help design to work on things that are found in that student feedback, and see whether you see big improvements.
Okay, thank you. Next.
Hi, I'm Linda Ruiz Davenport. I'm the Director of Elementary Math for Boston Public Schools. And I was just thinking about your remark about professional development. And I do know the measures of the impact of PD is a mixed picture. But I'm wondering, I'd like to hear more of your thoughts about how you help a teacher who does not perform well on the measures that you've described perform at higher levels on those measures. It feels like it's more than just feedback. So if we take professional development broadly, what's your vision of what that might look like in terms of support for teachers' practice?
So you know how there's been this movement recently about trying to personalize learning for students, so to differentiate instruction for students. Why don't we do that for teachers? Like, why is PD sort of, you know, one size fits all? You show up in a gym and somebody presents on a particular thing, and it's not personalized to where a teacher is. So now, I hope that there will be more models that start with the feedback, and then PD is designed around the feedback. But, you know, that'll be one of the next things we're working on, is what does that look like? And I know, hopefully, you know, districts will help us think about that. I think we all ought to be thinking about what does this imply about how could you build PD around personalized feedback for teachers rather than, you know, one size fits all.
Well, I regret our time is up, but I suspect that Mitch and Tom would be happy to entertain a few questions up here. Thank you all for coming, and please join me in thanking Tom and Mitch for an exciting forum.
That's great.